Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? I hope you're all right. You'll remember that last week I began to tell you about the history of SPAND, and we'll do so for the next few weeks. It is quite a long history, but we were talking about how things were for people with learning difficulties and disabling conditions 50 years ago and how I started to get involved. And I left you with a rather pivotal moment in 1972 when I was standing with a large group of people with disabling conditions in the square in Lourdes and decided to give my life away for them. And so I'm going to continue from that and then give you a little demonstration of what SPAN does in a little while. So after our first pilgrimage in 1972 with the Happy Wanderers group, and the decision I told you about last week, a series of amazing experiences with families followed in the next 4 years. We went to Lourdes each Easter week with a group, but we also had meetings, various masses and things during the year. And it was at Lourdes for the first time that I encountered a person with an epileptic fit. This lovely lady in a hotel one day where we were just collapsed, and Mrs. Mac, who I told you about, who was the nurse, said to me, "Get me a dessert spoon." And I said, "Pardon?" She said, "Get me a dessert spoon now." Oh, right, so we didn't argue with that lady. And this dear soul, Bridie, was on the floor having this fit, and I got her the dessert spoon, and she got the back of the spoon and put it into her mouth. I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I need to get her teeth out, because if she swallows her teeth with this fit, she'll be in trouble. She'll be able to breathe." I said, "All right." And we turned her on her side, did all the right things, as I've subsequently discovered you're supposed to do. And so she was trying to get your woman's teeth out, and during this time, Bridie, the lady, started to come round. And so Mac said to her, Bridie, "Oh, is that you, Mac? Yeah. You're all right, Bridie. You're all right," she said. "All right, you're fine, you're going to be fine. Bridie, just let me have your teeth so you don't swallow them." And she said, "Mac, they're my own." There was this lady kneeling on top of her, trying to lever the teeth out. And of course, all the time, they were her own. First lesson learnt. So there were many others to come, of course. And so we used to have these special masses together, which are a bit sort of happy-clappy. And I began to think to myself, surely there's got to be a bit something more than just singing these nice songs and happy-clappy stuff. There's got to be. But at that time, it had never happened at all, so it's quite significant. And then in 1973 and 74, at Spode House, which was a Dominican community near Rugeley, they had two very significant conferences at which a man called Père Henri Bissonnier came to speak to parents and interested people working with those who had learning difficulties, and myself and my friend were able to go to these conferences. It was absolutely amazing. This man pioneered catechesis for people with learning difficulties, a remarkable thing. And while I was there, I met some amazing priests, David Wilson, Morris Bartley, Sean Smith, Donal Lucy, Aidan Turner, and some remarkable parents as well. And listening to them was a very moving experience. At that time, of course, there was no catechesis for people with learning difficulties because others thought they didn't need it. Oh, well, they're angels anyway, so they don't need that, which is actually quite patronising. And much of those parents' concern had to do with whether their children could receive Holy Communion or not. Now, the bishops just didn't get it. They did not get the subtext. The subtext was very simple. If my Johnny is able to receive Holy Communion, that means that the church thinks of Johnny as a person and not just some handicapped kid. And they didn't get that. It was for those parents, it was the hallmark of whether their son or daughter was properly regarded as a person and a member of the community. And many of us got involved with trying to get the bishops to think about this and so on. It was quite a difficult thing to do. And then back in Birmingham, Maureen and a small group of us spent time visiting people with disabilities on a regular basis and made some lovely friends. She took two of us round one night with her when she was working, giving injections to dying people, and I saw one man in his living room in an iron lung. I'd never seen anything like that before. And she introduced us to a lovely lady called Kath. Kath Elkington was a Methodist lady who had muscular dystrophy and managed to live on her own, even in those days, nearly 50 years ago now, with a carer coming in each night to stay with her after Mrs. Mack had put her to bed. And we used to go and see her twice a week at 9 o'clock when we should have been saying night prayers in the college, of course. And she got beer and had it in the fridge and ravioli, because I happen to say I liked it. And we got very, very friendly with her, to the point that we took her to Blackpool for the day, two of us in a car that a friend from the rugby club took us with, and we were there in Blackpool. And this lady, you can imagine, she had a tracheotomy, and she had oxygen in it and a sucking machine. I mean, we knew nothing. And we took all this gear in the back of the car to Blackpool, and in the car park she says to me, "Right, suck me out, pardon." I said, "Shove this tube down here, health and safety, don't take any notice." And my friend Hugh was pumping the thing to get the stuff out, and then she says, "Right, I'll have a drop of juice." So we put some oxygen in there. I'm thinking, oh Lord God. We knew nothing, but we learned quickly. And while we were doing that, some of the students took her kitchen to bits and living room and redecorated it. And when we got back later in the evening, they were all sitting there flaked out on the floor. She was a wonderful person, and she did me the most incredible favour. Shortly before I was ordained, I went to see her, and and she said, "Are you looking forward to being a priest?" I said, "Well," I suppose so. I haven't thought about it much. I'm sure it'll be quite a lonely life. And I said, "Oh, I've never seen anybody dead." And she said, I said, "I'm a bit apprehensive." She said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I'll sort that out. I'll be the first." And believe me, she was. That is another story. But that was a wonderful thing. And I ended up through that group doing my first funeral when I was a deacon of a man called Walter Docker, who had a go at attacked his wife with an axe and spent 14 years in Broadmoor. That is another story, but he was my first funeral. That takes a long time to tell. And so that's what it was like in those years in Oscott, and it was a wonderful time. And the day after my ordination in 1975, 40 of my friends came and stayed overnight on the school floor on the Saturday night, and then 100 more came on the Sunday, and we had a wonderful mass together in St Mary's Church in Loughborough. And I knew that I was effectively saying goodbye to my Birmingham friends, but not to that work, of course. And my first appointment was to Our Lady in St Thomas's Parish in Sheffield in Woodseats, and there was a Cheshire home there, so I went and volunteered to work one night putting the blokes to bed. There were 3 special schools that I used to visit, and ended up being a governor of one of them. And then we also, there was a community of adults with learning difficulties, a place called Fairthorne, and I used to visit them. So I was carrying on that work anyway, until something happened on a very special day in March 1976. Our Bishop James, loved people with disabling conditions and was quite at his ease with them. He was not the man who was the most relaxed and happy, as you can remember, but he was very happy with, first of all, people who were sick, but also people who had disabling conditions, and especially when he went on pilgrimage to Lourdes. And he'd obviously found out about what I'd been up to and sent me a letter appointing me, in the words of the time, as chaplain to the handicapped in the diocese. I was absolutely thrilled. I thought, this is a gift from God. And so began work immediately from Sheffield, trying to locate people with special needs in different parts of the diocese. I discovered there were 2 CHCF, Catholic Handicapped Children's Fellowship groups, which met in Derby and Leicester, and they would visit families, as I said to you last week, and also have a party at Christmas and an outing in the summer. And there was a group in Leicester with a man called Larry Boyle, Sheila Taylor, Marjorie Smith, Celia Windram, and a young lady called Jenny Hickey. In Derby, there was a similar group in existence since 1959 with Margaret Barrow, Nora Sanders, Sheila North, and a nice young lady called Barbara Drummond, and a young sprog called John Crowley. But there was no group meeting regularly for any form of catechesis or mass. So I came to say mass in Derby on the first anniversary of my ordination, and was delighted to meet some lovely people, many of whom remain friends to this very day. At Christmas that year, we sent out requests for help through the diocese as the need for some form of regular gathering became obvious, and there was an offer of premises from the Dominicans in Leicester, St Peter's, Leicester, Father Joe Jones, and Ratcliffe College. In the spring of 1977, a coach from Leicester went to Walsingham for an outing, and what's called the Memphis Centre in Leicester opened its doors. This was the brainchild of several people, including a wonderful man called John White, who many of you will know from his time taking pilgrimages with HCPT to Lourdes. It was a wonderful, wonderful man indeed. And during that time, I did a course on the Open University, a half-credit course. Again, the language was dated, called The Handicapped Person in the Community. And it was extremely useful. And there was one sentence from that stayed with me all this time. A service or facility should only be established in response to an expressed need. In other words, you find out what the needs are, then you respond. You don't just come up with some clever idea and then impose it on people. It's been a very good thing. In the summer of that year, 1977, I went on retreat for a few days to Mount St Bernard's Abbey and met a lovely nun called Sister Andrew, who was a Loretto sister, and she later became Sister Bernadette. And I was talking to her about what I was trying to do and so on, and she offered the use of their convent in Aspley for us to start a group. So when she went home, she set about finding people who might want to come, and Father Peter Coyle, a wonderful friend from seminary days, was the curate there at the time, and he said a mass for a group of parents on the 18th of September 1977. And also there was a little gathering in Leicester at that time at St Patrick's, and 40 people came and would try to meet once a month off and on for the next year or two. And there was an initiative to visit people in St Mary's Wigston as well. Clearly there was also a need for some sort of respite in some ways, which families had expressed, and some offers for short-term care were sought. In the autumn of 1977, our first agency newsletter was born in the home of John and Helena Shackleton in Sheffield and circulated throughout the diocese, closely followed by the document I spoke to you of last week called Guideline 77, Notes for Priests and Pastoral Workers, which caused quite a stir, as I said. The Faith and Light movement continued to have pilgrimages each year in different places, Rome, Walsingham, Canterbury and Llanelli, before it completely changed tack in 1978 at our initiative. In a presbytery in Rotherham in the autumn of 1977, Father Maurice Bartley suggested to me that we organise a Faith and Light pilgrimage to Spink Hill. And I said to him, Maurice, there's no shrine there. You can't have a pilgrimage to a place where there's no shrine. Oh yeah, well, we'll have something, he said. And so we sat down and talked about it. And I said, well, let's call it a celebration. And I said, I will do some catechesis for our special friends. You can do a retreat for the parents. And so that's what we did. And that was the first ever Faith and Light celebration in the world, because we invented it, the two of us. And now they happen all around the place. So that was a wonderful thing. And in March of 78, I had a meeting with parents at Loretto Convent. Some were not very impressed when they heard it, because they'd heard it all before. And that was to be my first encounter with Jim and Margaret Dobbin and a wonderful lady called Pat Pete. And their example and friendship of love and love for me has been a continued inspiration to me and many others from that day to this. The Faith and Light celebration duly took place, and we published a report on it afterwards. And it was a great success, with happy campers from Ipswich under the leadership of two remarkable people, Kevin and Pat Keating. And in the chapel at Mount St Mary's College that week, something happened that had never happened anywhere at all before. And we invented the use of music and mime to interpret and proclaim the scriptures. And we encouraged our friends to do this and to take a lead, and it had never happened anywhere in the world before. It was one of those absolutely pivotal moments, as I'm about to demonstrate. Their parents were completely gobsmacked when they saw their children and young people doing this. And what we did was we presented the story of creation to David Kossuth's story of God making the world and the music of the Largo from Dvorak's New World Symphony. And we had a large group of people, 2 big cloths, one to represent the sky and one to represent the sea, little models of animals, and trees and birds, and Adam stretched out on the ground with God sitting on a chair above him. So picture that scene if you can, and I'm going to demonstrate exactly what happened by reading to you the script over this piece of music, bearing in mind that this had happened nowhere at all before. This is the story of the beginning of everything, before anything and anyone ever was, when there was only God on his own. A quiet, thoughtful God, full of love to give and with no one to give it to. God had been by himself for a long time. Perhaps he felt a bit empty, even bored, looking out into nothing, sitting, silent, still. And then, suddenly, he thought, I need something to do, something to live for. I know, I'll make a world. Mind you, before God started to make the world, he gave it a lot of thought. Big job, not much to go on, no previous experience of such a thing, and no good materials either. Right, said God, first things first, some light to work by. Let there be light. And there was. Pleasant effect, God thought, and turned it on and off a few times. Sometimes more dark, sometimes more light. I'll call them night and day, he said. God then looked at the endless water, too much, he thought, and decided to halve it. But where to put the other half? Nowhere to empty it. So he pointed upwards, and the water lifted into a gorgeous roof, with every colour and every kind of cloud. God looked up. I will call that heaven, he said. It looks a nice place to live. And so he moved in. God drew on the waters with his finger, and the land came up, the earth and the seas, he said. It looked a bit bare, so he covered it with plants and all kinds of vegetation, each with its own seed. Then God thought of a way to improve on his day and night invention, which was a bit harsh on the eyes with its sudden change. He hung outside his home 2 globes of light, a large one to look after the day, the sun, and a smaller one for the night, the moon. Nice effect. Then he made 1,000,000 smaller moons, which he called stars. God was enjoying himself. Next he said, things that fly and move and crawl and swim and walk. He used every colour and shape that came into his mind to make huge sea monsters and birds, tiny insects and delicate dancing creatures, and slow heavy ones. Nothing was forgotten. Multiply, he said. Fill the seas and the land and the sky. There's plenty of room, and so they did. God was pleased with his work, but he still had an odd feeling of loneliness, of something still to do. He sat looking down into a calm lake, down at his own reflection. Then he smiled. "That's it," he said. "I'll make someone to talk to, a man. He can look like me." So God took some dust and wet it. He molded it into a shape, like a statue, lying down on the ground. Then he bent over it and gently blew into its nostrils. Very slowly, it began to move and got unsteadily to its feet. And they looked at each other. God said, "You will be called Adam, and you will be my friend." Nothing like this had ever happened before. It was a truly groundbreaking moment. And this approach to liturgy and catechesis would become the hallmark of our work for the next 43 years. At that event, I renewed my friendship with Father Aidan Turner, who told me that one of his newly graduated students at Cambridge, Tony Wilkinson, was coming to live and work in Loughborough and might prove to be a useful contact. A Mass for the Deaf was celebrated in St Peter's, Leicester at the end of 1978, and the CHCF group continued to meet at St Patrick's. In September 1978, the contact was made with Tony Wilkinson, who met with myself, Father Simon Giles, and Sister Mary David in my parents' living room in Park Street, Loughborough. Sister Mary David knew everybody in the town and offered the convent premises for a group, should they be able to get one together. Father Simon and Tony began visiting families and were made very welcome. In Nottingham, things changed rapidly. Sister Andrew moved and was replaced by Sister Madeline Dunphy, and I was moved from Sheffield to West Bridgford, beginning work one night a week in the Cheshire home there. Tony Wheat recruited some wonderful people from the Becket School, and on the 7th of January 1979, the Loreto Thursday Club was born in the Sisters' Convent there. Meeting fortnightly on a Thursday evening with the catechesis led by the sisters, Pat Pete, Teresa Doherty and friends, and Jim and Margaret holding discussion groups with the parents. The convent was full of life and joy, and the sisters were and still are marvellous. In June that year, a retreat day was held for everyone at the Loughborough Convent, and a meeting took place in St Bernadette's Club in Scunthorpe with a view to starting a group there. It was not long before a group of people with Sisters Bernadette and Perpetua, Anne MacDonald, Maureen Guy and Father Dennis Higgins got together at St Bede's School to meet and formally began the group in 1980 at the Presentation Convent. At the end of that year, I discovered a man in the back end of Nottingham called John Leonard, who was to make a huge impression on me and all of us for the next 40 years. In July, we took a group from Nottingham to join the Keatings for the second Faith and Light celebration in Ipswich. And then offers for short-term care came from Father Brian Daisley in Colville, the Assumptionist Fathers in Nottingham, and St Norbert's Crowle, the Blessed Sacrament Fathers in Leicester. But much work needed to be done before we could accept them. We started the idea of a care day, which would involve taking groups of young friends out for the first Monday of each half term. And on October the 29th, 1979, the very first one took place with Father Roger Killeen and the Assumptionists in their house in the park in Nottingham. That would be a regular feature for some years. On the 9th of December 1979, the newly formed Loughborough group met for the first time in St Mary's School with Mass in the very classroom in which I had started my school life in England many years before. It was not long before young people in wheelchairs were having races round the cloisters of the convent, much to the delight of the sisters. On the 13th of February 1980, my father, Tim Daly, died in Loughborough. The friendship of our Nottingham and Loughborough groups was a key feature in the consolation of our sorrowing family. I will never forget them for it. In March that year, Tony Wilkinson published an article, Loughborough Group, the Early Days, in the Agency magazine, and meetings with parents in Leicester concerned about religious formation took place, and Jenny Hickey succeeded Mr Larry Boyle as Secretary of the CHCF there. In June of that year, a small group attended the Diocesan Retreat Day in Loughborough, and regular meetings continued. And in October 1980, another pivotal moment in our history arrived. Sister Madeleine Campion of the Sisters of St Joseph of Peace in West Bridgford joined the agency as Assistant Director. She had retired from being a head teacher because of an illness called lymphedema, which meant that she would later lose one of her legs. Her order funded her with a car to go around the diocese visiting people with physically disabling conditions, and she was very much welcomed by them and their families, spending much of her time in and around the Leicester and Grimsby areas. Each year in September, there had been a Mass for the handicapped in the cathedral when Bishop Ellis, initially and then later Bishop James, confirmed many people. This was done without real preparation, and in deciding that it should take place in each person's parish instead, as opposed to all of us being lumped together, I encountered much opposition at first, before families came to accept that their children should be included with their own peers in their own parishes as equals. The Masses continued, moving initially to St Teresa's in Aspley and shortly afterwards to Corpus Christi Church, Clifton, at the kind invitation of Father Joe McGovern and Mrs Vera Murphy, where we would stay for over 30 years. Each Mass had its own special themed liturgy, which involved everyone, and remained the highlight of our year when we could all come together in increasing numbers. 1981 beckoned, the International Year of Disabled People, and it was to be a time of huge development for all of us, which I will tell you about next time.